For 20 years, he was the man everyone called when life went wrong. If a bill needed paying, he handled it. If someone was in trouble, he showed up without hesitation. Birthdays, emergencies, broken promises, he carried them all, quietly, like it was his responsibility to hold everyone together. People admired him for it, leaned on him for it, depended on him without ever asking how much it was costing him. And maybe that was the problem, because somewhere along the way, the line between kindness and expectation disappeared. Then one day, without warning, he vanished from that life. No announcements, no explanations, just silence. When he finally returned, everything about him had changed. The confidence was gone, the comfort replaced by struggle, and for the first time in decades, he had nothing left to give. No money, no influence, no safety net to fall back on. What happened next didn't just surprise him. It forced him to confront a reality most people spend their entire lives avoiding. This was never about money. It was about truth. And the truth has a way of revealing itself when everything else is stripped away. Before we dive deep, let us know in the comments section where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Richard Cole had spent most of his life building something that looked unbreakable from the outside. A successful businessman, respected in his circle, admired by people who often spoke about his generosity as if it were a legend. But the truth about Richard wasn't just in what he built, it was in what he gave away along the way. Loans that were never repaid, opportunities handed out without hesitation, problems solved that were never truly his to carry. Over time, he became more than a friend to many people. He became a solution. And when someone becomes a solution, people stop asking questions. They stop wondering what happens when that solution disappears. That question stayed with Richard longer than he expected, quietly growing each time he noticed how quickly people reached out when they needed something, and how rarely they checked in when he didn't. It wasn't anger that pushed him, and it wasn't pride. It was something far more unsettling. It was doubt. The kind of doubt that doesn't go away until it's answered. So he made a decision that would change everything. Not just for him, but for every single person who had ever claimed to stand by his side. He would step away from everything that defined him. The wealth, the comfort, the reputation. He would remove the one thing that made people stay close. And in doing so, he would finally see what remained. But this wasn't just a personal experiment. It was a risk. Because once you see people for who they truly are, there's no going back to what you believed before. And Richard understood that. He understood that whatever he was about to discover could cost him more than money ever could. It could cost him the very relationships he thought were real. Why would a millionaire give up everything just to test the people around him? Who would stay when the money disappeared? And more importantly, who would quietly walk away without ever looking back? These weren't just questions anymore. They were the only things that mattered. Because by the end of this story, one truth becomes painfully clear: not everyone who smiles with you is for you. Richard Cole wasn't born into wealth, and there was nothing about his early life that suggested he would one day become the man everyone depended on. He grew up in a small, quiet neighborhood where stability was never guaranteed and where every dollar had to be stretched further than it should. His father worked long hours. His mother did what she could to keep things together. And from a young age, Richard learned that if he wanted something, he would have to earn it himself. There were no shortcuts, no safety nets, just discipline, persistence, and an understanding that failure wasn't an option he could afford. By the time he reached his late 20s, he had already experienced more setbacks than most people would tolerate. But he kept going. One small business turned into two, then into something bigger, something that finally gave him the kind of financial freedom he had spent years chasing. And when that success came, it didn't change him in the way people expected. It didn't make him distant or guarded. Instead, it made him more available, more generous, more willing to carry the weight of others because he knew what it felt like to struggle alone. Over time, Richard became known as the reliable one. The man who always answered his phone, always showed up, always found a way to fix things when everything else seemed to fall apart. Friends turned to him not just for advice, but for support that often went beyond what friendship usually demands. He helped cover rent when someone fell behind, invested in business ideas that never took off, paid for medical bills without asking for anything in return, and stepped in during moments when others chose to step back. To the people around him, Richard wasn't just a friend, he was a constant. and constants are rarely questioned. People grew comfortable knowing he would always be there, that no matter how difficult things became, Richard would find a way to make it easier. What they didn't see, or chose not to see, was how that role slowly reshaped the relationships in his life. Gratitude became expectation, appreciation became routine, and the balance that once defined those friendships quietly disappeared. Among those closest to him was Daniel Brooks, a man Richard had known for over 15 years. Their friendship had been built during a time when neither of them had much, when loyalty felt simple and unquestioned. Daniel was there during the early days, when Richard's ideas were just plans without certainty, and for a long time, that history was enough to convince Richard that their bond was unshakable. But as the years passed and Richard's success grew, the dynamic between them began to change in ways that were easy to ignore but impossible to deny. Daniel relied on him more, leaned on him more, and while he never openly took advantage, there were moments where the lines between friendship and dependency became unclear. Still, Richard trusted him. He believed that history meant something, that time invested in a relationship created a kind of loyalty that couldn't be replaced. And for a long time, he held on to that belief without question. Beyond Daniel, there was a wider circle of friends, people who came into Richard's life at different stages, each with their own connection to him, each benefiting in one way or another from his willingness to help. Some were business associates who became close over time. Others were longtime acquaintances who grew more dependent as Richard's capacity to give increased. They celebrated with him when things were going well, stood beside him when it was convenient, and spoke highly of his character whenever his name came up. On the surface, it looked like loyalty. It looked like genuine connection. But the deeper question, the one Richard hadn't yet fully confronted, was whether those relationships were built on who he was or on what he could provide. And that question stayed with him, quietly, persistently, waiting for the moment when it could no longer be ignored. Then there was Emily Carter, the one person in Richard's life who saw things differently. She wasn't impressed by the success or distracted by the generosity. Where others saw strength, she saw vulnerability. Where others saw reliability, she saw a man carrying more than he should. Emily had been part of Richard's life long enough to understand the patterns he couldn't see himself, and she wasn't afraid to speak on them. She noticed how quickly people called when they needed something and how rarely they reached out just to check on him. She noticed the imbalance, the way giving had become expected rather than appreciated. And unlike everyone else, she said it out loud. One evening, in a quiet moment that didn't seem significant at the time, she looked at him and said something that stayed with him long after the conversation ended. "You trust people too easily. One day, that's going to cost you." Richard didn't argue with her, but he didn't fully accept it either. Part of him believed that loyalty, once proven, didn't need to be questioned again, that the years he had spent building those relationships meant something deeper than convenience. But another part of him, the part that had started paying attention to the small inconsistencies, the missed calls, the one-sided efforts, couldn't ignore the possibility that Emily might be right. And that possibility was enough to change everything. Because once doubt enters a relationship, it doesn't leave quietly. It grows, it lingers, and eventually, it demands an answer. The question didn't arrive all at once. It formed slowly, built from moments Richard Cole could no longer ignore. A call returned too late. A favor accepted too quickly. A silence where support should have been. At first, he dismissed it, telling himself that people were busy, that life had a way of pulling attention in different directions. But the pattern repeated itself enough times that it stopped feeling like coincidence. It started to feel like something else entirely. And eventually, that quiet doubt turned into something he could no longer set aside. One evening, sitting across from Emily Carter, he said it out loud for the first time, not as a complaint, but as a realization he couldn't shake. It started as a simple question. If everything disappeared, who would still be there? The room fell silent in a way that made the weight of that question impossible to ignore, because deep down, he already knew that answering it would come at a cost. What followed wasn't impulsive, and it wasn't driven by emotion. Richard approached it the same way he approached everything that mattered in his life, with precision and patience. If he was going to find the truth, he needed to remove the one factor that had always defined his relationships. The money, the stability, the comfort that made people stay close without ever questioning why. He began putting things in place quietly, restructuring his business in a way that would allow him to step back without raising suspicion. Assets were moved, responsibilities handed over, and within a matter of weeks, the foundation of his visible success began to disappear. To the outside world, it looked like everything was falling apart. A bad investment, a sudden downturn, a series of unfortunate decisions that led to a collapse no one saw coming. People talked about it the way they always do, with speculation, with concern, with just enough distance to avoid getting too involved. Richard didn't correct them. He let the story take shape on its own, allowed people to believe what they needed to believe, because the truth behind it wasn't meant for them. Not yet. He stepped away from the life he had built, not dramatically, but gradually, until the version of him they were used to seeing was no longer there. The expensive routines disappeared. The availability he once offered so freely became limited, and the man who had always been the first to show up slowly became someone who needed help instead. Then, for a while, he disappeared completely. No calls, no appearances, no explanations. Just enough absence to make people notice, but not enough to make them question too deeply. And when he returned, he did so as someone they barely recognized. The confidence that once defined him was replaced by something quieter, something uncertain. The financial ease was gone, replaced by visible strain. He didn't announce it, didn't try to convince anyone. He simply existed in front of them as a man who had lost everything. At first, the reactions were exactly what he expected. Concern, curiosity, a few words of encouragement that sounded right but didn't carry much weight. People asked what happened, offered surface-level sympathy, reassured him that things would get better. But sympathy is easy when it doesn't require action. What Richard was waiting for came after that, in the days and weeks that followed, when the situation stopped being a conversation and started becoming a reality. That was when the shift began. Slowly at first, almost unnoticeable, but impossible to ignore once it settled in. Calls became less frequent. Messages went unanswered. Invitations stopped coming. The same people who once reached out without hesitation now seemed harder to reach, as if distance had quietly replaced familiarity. And Richard paid attention to all of it, not with anger, but with clarity. Then came the moment where the test truly began. He reached out, not to everyone at once, but individually, carefully, giving each person the same opportunity to respond in their own way. A request for help, simple and direct. Nothing excessive, nothing unreasonable. Just enough to see who would step forward the way he had done so many times before. And then he waited. Not for minutes or hours, but for something deeper. For intention. For effort. For proof that what he believed about those relationships still held some truth. But what he didn't expect was how quickly everything would change. At first, nothing about the reactions felt unusual. When Richard Cole began to let people see the version of his life that had fallen apart, the responses came in waves that sounded familiar on the surface. Concerned messages, brief calls, questions that carried just enough sympathy to acknowledge what he was going through without going too deep into it. Daniel Brooks was one of the first to reach out, his tone steady, his words supportive in the way longtime friends tend to sound when they believe things will eventually return to normal. He told Richard to stay strong, reminded him that setbacks happen, and assured him that he would figure it out. Others followed with similar responses, each one offering a version of encouragement that felt right in the moment but didn't extend much further than that. For a short period of time, it seemed like nothing had really changed. The connections were still there, the familiarity still existed, and Richard allowed himself to observe it without drawing conclusions too quickly. But time has a way of revealing what words try to cover. As days turned into weeks, the tone began to shift in ways that were subtle at first, almost easy to overlook if he hadn't been paying close attention. The calls became shorter, less frequent, often ending with promises to reconnect that never quite materialized. Messages that once received immediate responses now sat unanswered for hours, sometimes days, until they faded into silence completely. The invitations that used to come without hesitation slowly disappeared, replaced by a distance that no one openly acknowledged. Conversations, when they did happen, carried a different kind of energy, one that felt careful, measured, as if people were unsure how much of themselves they wanted to invest in someone who no longer held the same position in their lives. Richard didn't confront it, didn't question it. He simply watched as the connections he once trusted began to thin out in ways that couldn't be explained by circumstance alone. The real shift came when he stopped waiting and started asking. Not for anything significant, not for the kind of help that would put anyone in a difficult position, but for small things that mirrored the support he had given so freely in the past. A short-term loan to cover an expense. A favor that required time, not money. A conversation that needed more than surface-level attention. Each request was simple, reasonable, and familiar, the kind of things that had once been exchanged without hesitation. And one by one, the responses came back in ways that forced him to see those relationships more clearly than ever before. Daniel Brooks hesitated longer than expected before replying, eventually offering an explanation that sounded practical on the surface but lacked the certainty Richard had come to associate with their history. He said things were tight, that timing wasn't right, that he would help if he could. Others followed with similar patterns. I'm busy right now. I've got a lot going on. Things are tight at the moment. The words varied, but the meaning stayed the same. There were moments where the silence spoke louder than anything else. Richard would look at his phone after sending a message, watching the screen as if expecting something different to happen this time. Minutes passed, then hours, then entire days without a response. The same device that once connected him instantly to people who needed him now became a reminder of how quickly that connection could disappear when the roles were reversed. He didn't react outwardly, didn't express disappointment or frustration. But internally, something began to settle into place, something that couldn't be undone once it was fully understood. These were the same people he had stood by without hesitation, the same people whose problems he had made his own, the same people who had once spoken about loyalty as if it were something they all shared equally. These were the same people he once saved. And still, he continued the test, not because he needed more proof, but because part of him hoped there would be something different waiting at the end of it. That somewhere within that circle, someone would respond in a way that matched the belief he had held for so long. That history would matter, that effort would be returned, that loyalty would reveal itself when it was finally tested. But instead, what he found was a growing distance that became harder to ignore with each passing day. The connections he once relied on were no longer steady, no longer certain, and the man who had always been the one others depended on was now standing alone in a way he had never experienced before. And then, something happened that changed everything. What followed wasn't immediate, and it wasn't loud. It unfolded slowly, in a way that required patience to fully understand. Richard Cole stopped looking at his situation as a series of disappointments and began treating it like something that needed to be examined carefully. Every conversation, every delay, every excuse became a piece of a larger picture he was finally willing to see clearly. He didn't confront anyone, didn't accuse, didn't react. Instead, he observed. He paid attention to patterns, to consistency, to the gap between what people said and what they actually did. And as that picture came together, the people in his life began to reveal themselves in ways that no amount of time or history could have uncovered before. Each person became a case, not in a cold or calculated way, but in a way that forced the truth into the open without interference. Daniel Brooks was the first case Richard couldn't ignore. This was the friend who had stood beside him during the early years, the one whose history with him carried the most weight. There had been a time when Daniel needed help more than anyone else. A time when Richard stepped in without hesitation and carried him through a situation that could have ended very differently. That memory stayed with Richard, not as something he held over him, but as proof of what their friendship meant. Now, when the roles were reversed, the response felt unfamiliar. Daniel still answered occasionally, still spoke in a tone that suggested concern, but his actions didn't follow through in the way Richard expected. Plans to meet were postponed, offers to help were vague, and conversations ended before they reached anything meaningful. Richard replayed those moments in his mind, comparing them to the past, trying to understand where the shift had happened. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was realizing that the loyalty he believed was unshakable now depended on convenience. The second case was more subtle and, in some ways, more difficult to process. This was someone who never openly pulled away, someone who maintained the appearance of support without ever fully stepping into it. The messages were consistent, the words were right, and on the surface, nothing seemed out of place. He would say things like, Let me know if you need anything, or I'm here for you anytime. But when Richard took those words at face value and reached out, something always stood in the way. Timing never worked, schedules were always full, circumstances were never quite right. It created a pattern that was easy to miss if you weren't looking for it, a kind of support that existed in theory but never translated into action. Richard found himself reflecting on past moments, remembering times when this same person had needed him, times when he had rearranged his own life to show up without hesitation. The contrast was quiet but undeniable, and it raised a question that became harder to ignore with each passing day. Then came the message he never expected, not because of what it said, but because of what it revealed about how easily words can replace effort when no one challenges them. And then there was the third case, the one that didn't fit into the pattern he had started to recognize. This was someone who had never been at the center of his life, someone who existed on the edges of his circle without demanding attention or relying on his support in any significant way. There was no long history here, no defining moments that suggested a deeper connection. And yet, when Richard's situation became clear, this was the person who responded differently. The concern felt genuine, not rehearsed. The effort was immediate, not delayed. It wasn't anything extraordinary, not a grand gesture or a dramatic act of loyalty, but it was real in a way that stood out against everything else. A small offer of help that didn't come with hesitation. A willingness to show up without needing to be asked twice. It forced Richard to confront something he hadn't considered before, that sometimes the people you overlook are the ones who see you most clearly. As he moved between these cases, Richard began to notice a pattern that went beyond individual actions. It was something deeper, something that connected all of it in a way that couldn't be ignored. In the present, he saw distance, hesitation, and silence. But in the past, he remembered something entirely different. Moments where he had given without question, where he had stepped in without being asked, where he had made other people's problems his priority without expecting anything in return. The contrast between those two realities created a clarity he hadn't experienced before. It wasn't about keeping score, and it wasn't about regret. It was about understanding the truth of those relationships without the influence of expectation or assumption. But even with that clarity, there were still moments that caught him off guard, moments that pushed the realization further than he was prepared for. Just when he thought he had seen enough to understand what was happening, something else would surface, something that added another layer to the picture he was building. A conversation that revealed more than it intended to. A delay that carried more meaning than it should have. A response that arrived too late to matter. And each time, it reinforced the same quiet conclusion, that the people he once believed would stand beside him were revealing themselves in ways he could no longer ignore. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing that he had trusted it completely, without ever questioning what it was built on. By the time Richard Cole reached the end of what he had set in motion, there was nothing left to question. Every message he had sent, every call he had made, every moment of silence he had waded through had built toward a single point of clarity he could no longer ignore. What began as a quiet doubt had turned into something undeniable, something that no explanation or excuse could soften. And that was when the truth finally settled in, not as a shock, but as a realization that had been forming all along. This was never an accident. It was never a sudden collapse of relationships caused by unfortunate timing or circumstance. This was all planned, not by the people around him, but by Richard himself, long before any of them realized what was happening. He sat alone, going through everything one piece at a time, not rushing the process, not skipping over the details that mattered. The messages were the first thing he looked at, scrolling through conversations that once felt familiar, now seen through a completely different perspective. Words that used to sound supportive now felt distant, incomplete, lacking the weight they once carried. Promises that were made without intention, responses that came too late to matter, silences that spoke louder than anything written. Then came the calls, or rather, the absence of them. The people who used to reach him without hesitation now seemed harder to find, as if the connection they once relied on had quietly faded when it was no longer beneficial to maintain. And finally, he looked at who showed up, not just physically, but in the ways that truly mattered. Who made the effort? Who followed through? Who chose to stand close when there was nothing left to gain? It wasn't the strangers who failed him. It was the people he trusted the most. That was the part that stayed with him, the part that didn't fade with time or soften with understanding. These were the same people he had built years of history with, the same people he believed would stand beside him without question. And yet, when everything that defined his value in their lives was removed, so was their presence. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't sudden, but it was consistent enough to reveal a truth he had never fully allowed himself to see before. Trust, when placed without limits, doesn't always return in the way you expect. And loyalty, when assumed, isn't always real. But within that realization, there was something else, something that shifted the weight of everything he had just uncovered. Because while he was reviewing what was lost, he also began to notice what remained. There was one name that appeared differently from the others, one presence that didn't follow the same pattern of hesitation or distance. It wasn't someone from the center of his life, not someone he had invested the most time or energy into. It was someone who had existed on the edges, someone he had never fully recognized for what they were capable of. And yet, when everything changed, this was the person who responded without delay, without calculation, without needing a reason beyond the fact that he needed help. That realization carried a different kind of weight. It forced Richard to confront not only the reality of who had stepped away, but also the truth about who had quietly been there all along without expectation. The contrast between those two things was impossible to ignore. On one side, years of history that didn't hold under pressure. On the other, a connection that had never been tested until now, proving itself in a moment where it mattered most. And in that moment, Richard understood something that went far beyond the test he had created. Sometimes, the people you value the least are the ones who value you the most. And sometimes, it takes losing everything, even temporarily, to finally see that clearly. In the end, Richard didn't lose his wealth, not in the way he had allowed others to believe, because the business remained intact. The stability he had built was never truly gone, and the life he created through years of discipline and persistence still stood exactly where he had left it. But what he did lose was something far more significant, something that couldn't be measured in numbers or recovered through effort. He lost the illusion of friendship, the belief that the people around him valued him in the same way he valued them, the assumption that loyalty had been quietly growing alongside his success. And as that illusion faded, what remained was a clarity that was both difficult and necessary. Because once you see people for who they truly are, it becomes impossible to return to the comfort of what you once believed. I want to hear from you, and I mean that sincerely, not as a passing thought, but as something worth considering long after this story ends. Because what Richard experienced isn't as distant as it may seem. It reflects something many people sense but rarely test. So be honest with yourself for a moment. Look beyond the surface of your relationships, beyond the conversations and shared history, and ask yourself a simple question. Who in your life would truly pass this test? Who would stand beside you when there is nothing left to gain? When the comfort you provide disappears, when the roles are reversed and you are the one in need? And more importantly, would you be that person for someone else? Would you show up without hesitation, without condition, without expecting anything in return? Because loyalty is easy to claim, but far more difficult to demonstrate when it is no longer convenient. And if this story has done anything, it's revealed how quickly perception can shift when circumstances change, how the people we trust can either confirm that trust or quietly challenge it in ways we never expected. And as you think about that, consider this as well, because Richard's story may feel complete, but it's not unique. There are others who have taken the same path, who have asked the same question, who have created their own version of this test in search of the same truth. And in the next story, someone did exactly that. They chose to see beyond appearances, to challenge the reality they believed in. But what they uncovered went far beyond disappointment, far beyond silence. It led to an outcome that carried consequences they never anticipated. The kind that doesn't just change how you see others, but changes how you see yourself. And what they discovered next shocked them in ways they couldn't have prepared for. Because sometimes the answers we look for don't just reveal the truth about others. They reveal something deeper about the choices we've made and the people we've allowed into our lives. And that's when everything changed in a way that couldn't be undone. If you were in Richard Cole's position, with everything you believed in suddenly stripped away, forced to see your world without the comfort of what you provide, who would you call first? Whose name would feel certain enough to trust in that moment? And more importantly, Do you believe they would answer? Not eventually, not when it's convenient, but when it truly matters, because that question, simple as it sounds, carries a weight that most people never fully confront until circumstances leave them no choice. And perhaps that's why stories like this stay with us. Not because they are rare, but because they reflect something deeply familiar, something we recognize but often avoid examining too closely, the quiet understanding that loyalty, trust, and connection are not defined by words or time alone, but by actions taken when there is nothing to gain and everything to lose. And as you sit with that thought, it becomes clear that what Richard discovered wasn't just about the people around him. It was about the nature of relationships themselves, about how easily perception can shape belief, and how quickly that belief can shift when tested in the right way. And if this story has left you thinking, if it has made you pause and reflect on the people in your own life, then it has done exactly what it was meant to do. Because sometimes all it takes is one moment, one decision, one test to reveal everything we thought we understood. And if stories like this stay with you, if they challenge the way you see trust, loyalty, and the connections you hold on to, then consider staying with us. Subscribe because there are more stories like this, real moments, where one small decision changed everything, where the truth didn't arrive loudly, but revealed itself quietly in ways that could not be ignored. Stories that don't just tell you what happened, but leave you questioning what you would do if faced with the same reality. Subscribe and like.